Remembering Shimon Peres, what the Vatican is saying about the former Nobel Peace Prize winner. Escalating the fight against ISIS, the U.S. prepares to send more troops to Iraq. Preaching from the pulpit, where Catholics stand on a push for freedom to deliver political sermons. And Family First, Catholics in Mexico counter government efforts to redefine marriage. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, September 28th, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. He's being remembered as Israel's great peacemaker. Two-time Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres dies after suffering a severe stroke. Chief White House correspondent and political director Lauren Ashburn has reaction from around the world tonight.
Brian, President Obama summed it up by saying a light has gone out, but the hope he gave us will burn forever. He was a respected, powerful figure for peace in the world and across both sides of the political aisle. His loss is especially poignant as peace in the Middle East is stagnant. Worldwide mourning for the two-time Israeli president and Nobel Peace Prize winner. The Israeli statesman served almost all positions in his government. He's known for developing Israel's nuclear weapons and for working out a historic peace agreement with Palestinians, announced here at the White House on the South Lawn. It called for self-government in Gaza and part of the West Bank, both controlled by Israel. Pope Francis sent his condolences, saying he hopes that Peres' efforts for peace will inspire other world leaders.
The Pope admired the efforts of Shimon Peres for peace, and I would say also the perseverance. The two things go together. You know, if you want lasting peace, you're going to have to be willing to persevere, and that was Shimon Peres.
President Obama, who awarded Peres the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor, called him a friend who, quote, changed the course of history by expanding our moral imagination. Former President Bill Clinton, who championed the 1993 Oslo Peace Accord with Peres, called him a genius with a big heart who used his gifts to imagine a future of reconciliation, not conflict. And Speaker of the House Paul Ryan wrote, "The world has lost a true legend and statesman. Shimon Peres was a gift to the country he helped establish and lead, and a persistent voice for the cause of peace." Peres' funeral is on Friday. President Obama, Hillary and Bill Clinton, and Prince Charles will be attending. Brian?
Lauren Ashburn at the White House, thank you. Congress overwhelmingly hands Barack Obama the first veto override of his presidency today. The Senate and House reversed the presidential veto of a bill. It allowed families of September 11th victims to sue Saudi Arabia for its alleged backing of the attackers. Democrats in both chambers abandoned the president in large numbers. This despite his warnings that flaws in the bill could put U.S. interests, troops, and intelligence personnel at risk. The Senate passes a bill today to keep the government running through December 9th. It also provides $1.1 billion in long-delayed funding to battle the Zika virus. That spending measure is the last major item on Capitol Hill's pre-election agenda. The House is expected to quickly approve the measure and sending it to the president for his signature. In fact, that's happening as we speak. Republicans introduce a bill today to protect preachers from the IRS. It's called the Free Speech Fairness Act. Jason Calvi reports from Capitol Hill tonight. Jason?
Brian, the U.S. tax code bans nonprofits and churches from endorsing or opposing political candidates. It's called the Johnson Amendment. It dates to then Senator Lyndon B. Johnson. But this year, the Republican Party platform calls for getting rid of it. Donald Trump pitched repealing the Johnson Amendment in his Republican convention speech and when speaking to Christian voters.
And I will repeal the Johnson Amendment if I am elected your president. I promise.
Devoting 9 paragraphs of his values voter speech to the topic.
The Johnson Amendment has blocked our pastors and ministers and others from speaking their minds from their own pulpits.
Republicans and Christian leaders today talk about a new bill, which would, in part, allow ministers in a sermon to praise or criticize a candidate.
And the threat dangling out there is that if you cross that line, your church or your nonprofit could lose tax-exempt status.
Protestant pastor and Congressman Jody Heiss is sponsoring the counter to the Johnson Amendment. But what does Catholic teaching say about politics and preaching? The church teaches the choice of the political regime and the appointment of rulers are left to the free decision of the citizens, as long as they serve the common good. EWTN senior contributor Dr. Matthew Bunson says the church does give moral guidelines for voters.
The church will provide you important teachings on how to form your conscience properly, how to make proper moral judgments. But the other aspect, too, is how to work for that common good. And the church also needs to be fearless and has the obligation and the right to speak out prophetically and powerfully on the major issues of any era. Today, for example, abortion.
Americans United for the Separation of Church and State is opposing the repeal of the Johnson Amendment. They say it could lead to corruption between politicians and churches. Now, EWTN, as a nonprofit charity, cannot endorse or oppose a candidate. And we saw one high-profile Catholic organization, Catholic Answers, was fined by the IRS back in 2004 for saying then nominee John Kerry should not receive Holy Communion. Brian?
And Jason, what are the odds this repeal is going to happen anytime soon?
Very, very, very unlikely, if not impossible. Just a few more days left in the session. All the lawmakers will be out of here by Friday, and then they won't return until after the election. So the possibility of it actually impacting this election is impossible. Brian?
Jason Calvi on Capitol Hill, thank you. Turning to our politics this evening, Donald Trump returns to the campaign trail today in Chicago. He says his knack for creating jobs will help him in the White House.
I'm very good for jobs. In fact, I will be the greatest president for jobs that God ever created, that I can tell you.
Trump, who earlier criticized NATO, now calls the alliance very important, saying he wants it to be strong. Big-name Democrats rally for Hillary Clinton. For the first time since he endorsed her, Bernie Sanders joined Mrs. Clinton at a rally in New Hampshire. Earlier today, First Lady Michelle Obama called Clinton the real deal during a speech in Pennsylvania.
Because when making life or death, war or peace decisions, a president just can't pop off or lash out irrationally. No, we need an adult in the White House.
Early voting is already underway in states such as North Carolina and Florida. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. The U.S. is now preparing to send more troops to Iraq to help reclaim the city of Mosul from the Islamic State group. An administration official says the troops will train and advise Iraqi forces as planning for the Mosul operation ramps up. This move expands the U.S. military footprint in Iraq just months before President Obama hands over the conflict to his successor. The Pentagon says the U.S. already has roughly 4,600 troops in Iraq. People in Southern California gathered to protest yet another police shooting. Officers killed an unarmed black man who threatened them with something they later discovered was not a weapon. Witnesses recorded the aftermath.
Okay, so the police did it again, y'all. They shot another unarmed black person, as usual. And the lady is saying she called them for help, not to kill her brother.
Police say the man was acting erratically at a shopping mall in El Cajon near San Diego. They say he bent down into what they called a shooting stance right before officers opened fire. This shooting comes just weeks after fatal police shootings in Tulsa and Charlotte sparked violent protests. The head of the FBI says the agency is creating a new database to track police use of deadly force. FBI Director James Comey testified for a second consecutive day on Capitol Hill. He says he wants to replace anecdotes about police shootings with facts. Comey also talked about problems with cybersecurity, including an attack on the presidential election process.
We are doing an awful lot of work through our counterintelligence investigators to understand just what mischief is Russia up to in connection with our election.
Representative John Conyers says intelligence officials have reached a clear consensus that the Russian government was behind the hack of the Democratic National Committee emails earlier this year. Investigators are probing the crash of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. They allege a Russian missile took down the plane, a charge that Moscow denies. The head of the Dutch-led criminal investigation says the plane, carrying 298 people, was shot down in 2014 by a Buk missile. It had been moved into eastern Ukraine from Russia. A separate investigation by Dutch safety officials last year reached the same conclusion. That plane crashed in eastern Ukraine, an active war zone. Secretary of State John Kerry threatens to cut off all contact with Moscow over the Syrian civil war. The U.S. accuses Russia and Syria of launching more military strikes against civilian hospitals and water supplies in Aleppo. Pope Francis makes an appeal for peace in Syria at today's general audience in St. Peter's Square.
E appello alla coscienza dei responsabili dei bombardamenti.
The Holy Father decries the assault on Aleppo, saying, "I appeal to the conscience of those responsible for the bombings who will have to give an account before God one day." The Holy Father calls Aleppo a martyred city, asking world leaders to use their power to protect civilians. The Pope's main message to pilgrims visiting the Vatican today: seek forgiveness. He says Jesus offers salvation to every person, regardless of their situation. Pope Francis also invited Mexican pilgrims to sing a prayer to Our Lady of Guadalupe for the suffering people of Mexico. The Holy Father laments the recent murders of 3 Mexican priests. He prays that Mexicans seek comfort in Christ, the face of the Father's mercy. Demonstrators recently marched in Mexico City, protesting President Enrique Peña Nieto's push to redefine marriage. The crowds of protesters were estimated in the hundreds of thousands. A Catholic activist in Mexico City tells us marchers also have other concerns.
The thing that worried many of the families was that the state was trying to be in charge of sexual education in schools with programs that not all the families agree with them. So the march was mostly to celebrate families and to ask the government to respect the families' right for their children's education.
And appearing to back the march, Pope Francis voices support for the bishops of Mexico in their commitment to life and the family. Coming up, the ethics of artificial conception. Catholics respond to news of a baby conceived through 3 parents. And rejecting Catholics for choice. How the group's new political ads counter church teaching. Thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Catholic scholars caution against a new medical procedure resulting in the birth of a baby using DNA from 3 people. The New York doctor who performed the procedure says the child is healthy, but many call it a dangerous experiment. Wyatt Goolsby is here with more. Wyatt?
Brian, this new experimental procedure is being called the 3-parent technique. The idea is to prevent a child from inheriting genes with potentially life-threatening flaws. But Catholics say it's not ethical and could create a host of new medical problems.
New York fertility doctor John Zhang says this baby boy, born in April, is the first child conceived using the new 3-parent technique. To make sure the baby did not inherit his Jordanian mother's rare genetic gene, Zhang took the nucleus out of her egg and implanted it into another woman's egg. Then the doctor fertilized the egg with the husband's sperm. The in vitro fertilization process means the woman's egg was fertilized outside the womb, one of many reasons why Catholic bioethicists like Dr. John Brahaney object to this new experimental procedure.
Human life comes to be essentially in a petri dish in a lab and does not take place within an act of authentic conjugal love means that it's not truly a good thing.
Brahaney says the Church also rejects the idea of adding a third party into conception. While the baby appears healthy now, Brahaney says there's no guarantee it will stay that way. The procedure was not done in the U.S., where it has not been approved by the FDA, but in Mexico, which does not have strict regulations. In his online blog, Dr. Zhang admits the procedure is controversial, but he says, if we are successful, what then? If there is a cure for what was once considered an infant's death sentence, should it not be explored regardless of the controversies? He references Galileo, who was branded a traitor for his writings on the universe. Dr. Melissa Moschella says there's no comparison.
It had nothing to do with risks to human well-being, to basic human dignity. What this doctor is doing is a clear physical and psychological risk to human beings and perhaps to humanity down the generations.
Both Dr. Muscala and Dr. Braheny say the Catholic teaching at its core sees a baby as a gift from God. So experiments like these go against that because people see a baby as a right, not as a gift. Brian?
Thank you, Wyatt Goolsby. And advertisements that the U.S. bishops deem to be deceptive are showing up in surprising places. Catholics for Choice, a group advocating for abortion, recently bought full-page ads in several cities. They call for taxpayer funding of abortion in the name of the Catholic faith. One of the ads recently appeared in the Weekly Standard. That's a conservative magazine. Joining us now, Mary Powers, a Catholic freelance writer whose work has appeared in the Daily Caller, Catholic Vote, and The Federalist. How have the U.S. bishops responded to these ads, Mary?
Well, Brian, they have responded very strongly to these ads, not only the USTCB, but individual bishops across the country, separating themselves from Catholics for Choice, saying that they don't have an affiliation with the Catholic Church, and they reaffirm the Church's teaching on life, saying that it's not a social good, abortion is not a social good, but rather that loving the woman and the unborn child is the social good.
Tell us more about this group, Catholics for Choice, and is this the first time they've run these types of ads?
It's not the first time. Catholics for Choice is a radical pro-abortion, anti-Catholic organization, even though it is under the guise of being Catholic. And it has undercut the USTCB as well as the Vatican internationally at the UN. And so they are a very radical organization that is doing this.
They are calling for the end of the Hyde Amendment. What is the Hyde Amendment and how do they suggest removing it?
Well, the Hyde Amendment is actually turning 40 on Friday, and it's a pro-life amendment that the Senate and the House has passed. And it's basically protecting Americans from funding abortion through Medicaid. And 2 million lives have been saved from abortion over the last 40 years, and 60,000 lives have been protected annually. And so, opening up this loophole for more funding for abortion is not good for Catholics, it's not good for taxpayers and people of conscience across the country.
And it should be pointed out, it has bipartisan support, or has had that throughout these decades.
Right.
What is your reaction to the Weekly Standard running that ad?
Well, it was very shocking and disappointing to see them run it. And, I hope that they apologize not only to the subscribers, but also, do an internal check as well, because they are taking money from a pro-abortion organization and, using it to fund their magazine, and even though they know it's wrong, and they have run pro-life articles before. And so, they have to look, well, are we using pro-abortion money to, keep our lights on, to pay our writers? How is this money being used?
A lot of questions. Mary Powers, freelance writer, The Daily Caller. We appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.
Up next, taking the pulse of the nation on the debate over religious liberty and making the case for sainthood of a 19th century priest from Tennessee. On Wednesday, September 28th, thanks for joining us for EWTN News Nightly. President Obama chooses career diplomat Jeffrey De Laurentiis to serve as the first U.S. ambassador to Cuba. De Laurentiis is already the top diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Havana, overseeing its reopening. His Senate confirmation, though, will be difficult. Republican Senators Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, both Cuban Americans, have pledged to block his nomination in the Senate. Migrants living in makeshift camps in a Rome neighborhood receive food twice a week, compliments of the Vatican. Monsignor Konrad Krajewski, the Pope's top charity official, distributes food with the help of volunteers. With the increasing number of migrants, volunteers say that donated food does not cover their needs. There is also concern about inadequate shelter with colder weather coming to Rome. Pope Francis has ramped up the centuries-old practice of Vatican almsgiving as an extension of his own personal charity. A new report sheds light on where Americans stand on religious liberty and non-discrimination. In a Pew Research report released today, 67% of surveyed Americans believe employers with a religious objection to birth control should still be required to provide it. Americans are more split on other religious liberty issues. 49% say businesses that provide wedding services should be required to provide those services to same-sex couples. 51% think transgender people should be allowed to use the public restroom of their choice. Dr. Greg Smith, Associate Director of Research at the Pew Research Center, co-authored this report. Greg, what was the research designed to find out?
Well, we really wanted to explore public opinion about some of the issues related to religious liberty that have cropped up in recent years. And what we found is that there's really a consensus on the part of the public when it comes to the question of whether or not employers should have to cover contraception in the health plans offered to their employees, even if the employer has religious objections to that. 2/3 of the public says they think, yes, employers should have to cover contraception. But on a couple of other issues, like whether or not wedding-related services should have to provide service to same-sex couples if the business owner has religious objections, and on the question of which public restrooms transgender people should be able to use, the public on those questions is quite evenly divided. About half comes down on one side, the other half on the other.
Was there any difference between Catholics and people of other religions?
Yeah, on most of these questions, Catholics look a lot like the public as a whole. About 2/3 of Catholics think that businesses should have to cover contraception in their health plans, and Catholics are evenly divided on the question of whether wedding businesses should have to serve same-sex couples, and on whether transgender people should be required to use restrooms corresponding to their birth gender.
Did you break down Catholics who actually attend Mass versus those who don't?
We certainly did. We often see differences in opinion between weekly Mass-going Catholics and Catholics who don't attend Mass that often. On these issues, as on so many others, regular Mass-going Catholics express more conservative views than Catholics who go less often. However, you might be struck to know that even among Catholics who say they attend Mass weekly, about half say they think employers should have to cover contraception, even if the employer has religious objections to that.
That is surprising. You've done extensive research in this area. Did anything surprise you about these results?
One of the things that really struck me in the results is that the public is polarized on these issues. That is to say, there aren't many people on either side of these issues who say they sympathize very much with the opposite point of view. People really only tend to sympathize with their side of these arguments. I was struck by that.
Very divisive issues. Dr. Greg Smith with the Pew Research Center, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And Knoxville, Tennessee's bishop recently opened the beatification cause of a 19th century priest. Father Patrick Ryan was born in Ireland and went on to minister to mission churches in Tennessee. He died at the age of 33 while serving the sick and dying. Father David Carter is the Episcopal delegate for the cause of sainthood for Father Patrick Ryan. He's joining us by Skype from Saints Peter and Paul Parish in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Father, what is it about Father Ryan's life that leads you to believe he should be declared a saint?
I believe that his heroic witness throughout his time as a priest, but most especially in his heroic gesture of self-sacrifice during the yellow fever epidemic of 1878, is what exalts him into another category. His witness is one to be followed, one to be emulated. His priestly sacrifice of his very self in ministering to his flock at great peril to his own health and ultimately the source of his own death was hailed even by the non-Catholic community in Chattanooga as heroic.
In laying down his life, what witness can this 19th century priest provide for us in the 21st century, especially for you as a priest and others?
Right, that Christian charity stands above all things, that this life and all that it promises and all that it has for us is not the ultimate end of our humanity. Our humanity is to be with God forever in heaven, and God is charity himself. God is love.
And I wonder what it means to you and your parishioners there at Saints Peter and Paul Parish that Father Ryan served in the same parish where you now serve.
I think we have a tendency to think of saints as far away, as remote and distant in time. This is an example and a witness that comes right from our very community. He walked the streets that we walk. He is a member of the community that we're a member of. And it should inspire us that holiness is for me too. Sainthood is for me too. The Catholic Church excels when she produces saints, when people respond to the gospel message and follow the way of Jesus in that self-sacrifice. And here's someone who did it right here in Chattanooga.
And we will continue to follow his cause with you. Father David Carter, joining us from Saints Peter and Paul Parish in the Diocese of Knoxville. Father Carter, thank you.
You're most welcome.
And we're celebrating tonight. EWTN inaugurating its new Rome office next door to the Holy See Press Office, steps away from St. Peter's Square, a sign of the network's growing presence in the Eternal City. Guests, including many Vatican officials, ambassadors, and journalists, gathered on the terrace overlooking the Vatican for tonight's celebration. CEO Michael Warsaw says the new office will help EWTN serve our viewers.
We're very happy about the opening of the new Rome office. It really, I think, positions the network even better, in an even better way, to be able to bring news and information about the church from the heart of the church to our audience around the world.
For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. Good night. God bless.